Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming to this month's Tunnel Talk. We're going to be talking a little bit about integrative pest management of high tunnel pests, focusing more on the insect side of things. So that's fantastic. Let me see if I can. All right, so I'm not going to go over the housekeeping really because we're all pros at this point. The one thing I am going to point out, because we are offering pesticide points today, you just have to make sure that the name that's displayed on Zoom is going to match your pesticide license name. If you have multiple people watching, then everyone sort of has to have their own presence or little box on the screen so that we can get you those points. For those of you who haven't really done pesticide points over webinar, you do have to stay for the length of the session. And at the end, I'll pop up a survey that you just have to fill out and then get either a screenshot or print screen of that survey, which basically just has your license number, name, all that good stuff. So I'll be popping that up at the end. We have a few upcoming events for this webinar series. Next month, I'm going to be doing a bit of a hands-on tutorial for our new spray guides. I'm trying to do this as hands-on as possible. It's a bit tricky with a web tool, but I think that we will have sort of like a list of questions that we're all going to work through just to better understand the new format now that we've moved away from our paper guides. It's much easier to navigate where we can look for greenhouse-specific products, both distinguish between conventional products and more biological-based products. Yeah, so we're pretty excited about that. I'm hoping to get pesticide points for those as well, but I'm not totally sure if you can, if it's just like more of a tool as opposed to actual pesticide application tips. And then June 2nd, I'm going to be talking a little bit about hydroponic production. So we've been talking a lot about soil fertility and nitrogen application, and figured it was time just to switch it up. So stay tuned for that. We have a Living Labs field day coming up April 16th. We're going to be looking at cover cropping in annual systems in Newport Station. So I highly recommend you guys come out and see the work that we've been doing over the last few years. And sort of on that vein of pesticide points, there is some Marbicon pesticide training coming up. There's going to be 5 points available for participating in that day. So they're bopping all over Nova Scotia. You can kind of check out the dates here, but I believe that the Department of Agriculture newsletters are also posting these dates in case you want a refresher on that. So with that, we have a guest speaker today, Cheryl Frank Sullivan. She's coming from us from UVM. I had a lovely little bio in my notes, but my notes aren't popping up. But she's got a lot of experience, I believe, ticks and high tunnel pests. Is that right, Cheryl?
Mm-hmm. Greenhouse and high tunnel pests.
Fabulous. So we're giving you the really short and sweet version of that bio today. I apologize for that.
Okay, so hi everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk a little bit about high tunnel IPM. Real quick, like a bit about what I do here at UVM. So I'm a part of a research team that strives to develop effective and practical IPM strategies to solve real world problems. So at our lab, we're really diversified, but my research and outreach efforts are primarily focused on greenhouse and high tunnel IPM and tick ecology and management. So a big chunk of my work focuses on biocontrol use, particularly developing fungal-based biopesticides and strategies to sustain parasites and predators as chemical pesticide alternatives. So I also spend a lot of time providing one-on-one assistance to farmers about IPM so they can put it all into practice in ways that work for them. So almost all the veggie farms that I work here in Vermont are small, very diversified, and certified organic. So high tunnels are great to extend the growing season by adding protection from adverse environmental conditions. Unfortunately, as much as the plants like that protection, their pests do too. So that restricted air movement as that plant canopy thickens provides these areas of high temperatures and humidity within that the pests really like. So this tends to cause hot spots where infestations can get out of control really quickly. So what do we do about the pests? We manage them using an integrated approach that combines multiple tactics. IPM is a decision-making process that takes into account thresholds that determine when to take action against the pest and economics to balance out the cost of control versus the cost of damage that they cause. So the foundation of IPM is based on prevention with cultural strategies, and then some form of control strategy like biocontrol agents or biorational pesticides to intervene before damage occurs. So those broad spectrum chemical pesticides really should only be used as a last resort. So prevention is the first line of defense against pests, and we either need to break up their life cycle or reduce the odds of that population becoming established in the first place. So this means striving to start clean to stay clean. And there's a whole lot of strategies to reduce pest pressure and make that environment a lot less suitable for them to establish. I'm not going to cover all these for the sake of time, but give some of these a try this season if you don't already do them, like checking plant material that's purchased in. If you do that, you want to avoid rotating crops into already infested tunnels, train your staff what pests look like and where to find them, and try using biocontrol preventatively and not reactively. And things like managing weeds and debris, and consider using these things called plant-mediated IPM systems that help attract and sustain natural enemies, and they can also help you detect pests early. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit later on. But first, I want to talk about scouting. And that really is a cornerstone of IPM because you definitely don't want your crops looking like they do in these two pictures. So be proactive and develop a plan that fits into your production. Scouting has a ton of benefits, and they can have profound impacts on your pest management success because it really determines how many plants are infested and at what magnitude. And that's really important because it determines if biocontrols can be used, their release rates, if a problem's too far gone, and a pesticide is needed. So scouting evaluates efficacy of your intervention. So first and foremost, you really want to get to know your friends from your foes. In short, you want to know where they live, like in the soil versus on the foliage. You want to know what their life stages look like, and you want to know how and when they attack their prey and under what conditions that they perform the best. A scouting toolkit with things like sticky cards, hand lenses, flags, and other tools are a helpful way to stay on top of scouting. And this way you're going to have all these tools on hand because you can carry them around tunnel to tunnel. And scouting really should combine sticky cards with plant inspections because sticky cards really only capture those adult winged insects. So plant foliage should be inspected by either tapping that over a laminated piece of white paper, or you can use some other white surface to do that. Or you can just visually inspect them by turning turning foliage over to look for those pests that are hiding underneath. So different parts of the plant should be inspected because certain pests hide within different places. And this really should be done, especially with plants that are brought into the tunnel environment or the greenhouses, because a lot of times they can harbor other pests. And when you find these during scouting in the tunnel, you want to flag these areas so you can refer back to them, especially if you make a treatment there so you can evaluate how it worked. Because it's really easy to forget where exactly that problem is. Because I know like you just forget. I know I do. So all the staff that work for you, if you have staff, they really should be trained about what pests to look for. And if you're going to be scouting, it's really good to have one particular person be that designated scout. So when you inspect these plants, you should do it systematically, something like 10 plants for 100 square feet or 100 foot of bed length. And if you divide the plant up into like 3 stratums, you can select a certain number of leaves per stratum to visually inspect. And really, this just allows for a representative inspection of the whole plant. So one of the most important tasks is to record your observations, especially how many are infested, like a percent infestation of the crop. And this is really important, especially if you get a number estimate, because a lot of times I see pest management fail, especially using biocontrol. And that's because the wrong intervention rate was applied to the crop square footage for the amount of pest pressure that is there. Or a lot of times those interventions were applied at the wrong time during the pest life cycle. So your biocontrol suppliers really need this information to make proper recommendations. So if you can, head into a new cropping cycle clean, and this can be useful to fallow your tunnels. It's not really cut and dry how long to do so, but it's good to try to get at least a couple weeks in with an empty tunnel before crops and make sure all those crop residues are removed. And here's kind of like an example of a not so smooth transition to spring crops. So I've seen a lot of growers transition tunnels to new crops, and they would plant clean plants into tunnels that already have infested plants in them. So this tunnel had a major infestation of aphids on their late winter greens that was left unchecked. So when they transitioned into summer crops, the aphids just jumped to the new plants and they just continued to battle aphids all summer on the transplanted crops. And you can also see that there's a bunch of weeds that are along the edge, and that also acted as a source of pests. So yeah, weeds should be kept at bay because they tend to harbor a lot of these pests and they can be that source of those future outbreaks. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a fallow tunnel to find weeds growing that have aphids and other pests on them in the dead of winter, especially those ones that tend to grow along the edges. So maintaining some weed mats within with some mulching are really good strategies to help keep those weeds at bay. And here's an example of a tunnel where you won't really see that many weeds popping up. You also want to try to maintain the exterior as well. Mowing is really good, but stone or weed cloth is even better. And some growers even opt for strips of habitat plants to attract beneficials. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about doing that shortly. And exclusion screens and floating row covers work great for a lot of these larger pests. So those being cucumber beetles, Colorado potato beetles, various moths whose larvae are hornworms, cutworms, armyworms, etc. And these strategies tend to be a double-edged sword because not only do they exclude pests, but they also exclude a lot of natural enemies and pollinators as well. And they can also limit airflow that can cause plants to heat up. So some of these pests that work well, or the exclusion works well for, are those larger pests, especially the ones that are in field crops that tend to show up at the same time of year, because you can kind of predict when they're going to show up and get things covered. And hornworms are kind of one example of that. The tomato hornworm has that V-shaped stripe and that black horn on its rear. And we tend to see this one later on in summer, but really it's that tobacco hornworm we're seeing the most of, and that has those diagonal white stripes and a red horn. And you can see these also if they overwinter in your tunnels, because we do start seeing a lot of them overwintering here now, and especially when they're under all this debris and pupa. But really it's that frass that you see on the foliage that you first notice that you have them, or you see that the plants are defoliated from the top down. And the picture on the bottom is a hornworm that has been parasitized by a parasitic wasp called Catesia that targets the caterpillars. So the wasps, they lay their eggs within, and afterwards the wasps develop and they hatch and they emerge to pupate on the hornworm. So that's a really cool naturally occurring biocontrol that we often see. So screening cucumber tunnels helps to significantly reduce cucumber beetle damage. And here's some examples of that, but also works well for excluding Colorado potato beetles and flea beetles as well. So that high tunnel environment is that hybrid between the uncontrolled field and a controlled greenhouse environment. So you have to use a hybrid approach to using biocontrol. You should really consider one, especially for a lot of those smaller, more hard to manage pests. So first, there's an augmentative strategy, and you use your commercially reared natural enemies. And that really has to be in place early in the cropping cycle before pest populations build up. And this is when natural enemies from the outside are not fully functional because they're not really at the peak of their seasonal activity yet. So in addition to commercially reared ones, a conservation biocontrol strategy can also be considered. And this focuses on the use of habitat plantings and providing habitats that are favorable for native natural enemies. So this also enhances your releases of commercially reared biocontrols because it gives them the things that they need to effectively find and manage pests like food and shelter. Okay, so these conservation planting strategies fall under what we call plant-mediated IPM systems. And these serve several individual or multiple functions, and their use really depends on what your specific pest management objective is. For example, you have indicator and trap plants that attract pests, and they're used for the early detection of them or to suppress or kill them. And then you have banker, habitat, and secondary plants, and those are all used with the objective to attract and produce natural enemies. And then you have a guardian plant system that kind of encompasses all these functions in one. So let's talk now a little bit about these smaller pests that are so hard to manage and some of their biocontrols. First are mites. And there's several mites of concern in tunnel crops, and those are two-spotted spider mites, there's broad mites, and tomato russet mites. And two-spotted spider mites, you can see on the upper right hand of the screen, they have those two dark spots like their name suggests, and they're found on leaf undersides, and they particularly like eggplant, cucumber, and tomato. And they like to overwinter on weeds and debris along tunnel edges and structures. And they can also turn red during the short days of winter. And infestations can start along edges or near places where they have overwintered. So here's some examples of spider mite damage. They have that webbing, hence their name. And that's pretty much a pretty extreme example of a spider mite infestation when they're actually dripping off the crops. And then they also cause this yellow stippling that's visible on the leaf surfaces, and they can also cause this flecking on the fruits. And broad mites have been showing up more and more in tunnels over the past several years. And I tend to see broad mites in locations where vegetable transplants have been obtained from places that were also producing greenhouse ornamentals. And these mites can dramatically affect peppers, eggplants, and tomatoes. Unfortunately, it's often too late to do much about them once that severe damage appears. So it's really best to pull out any of those infested plants, especially when fruiting, because they can just spread everywhere. And they're very, very tiny, and they can only be identified using a microscope. And tomato russet mites can occasionally be a problem, but that's really more of a southern sort of pest and not so much in the north. And they tend to cause this browsing of the plants and have this rusty color buildup when infestations are high. And also it's another reason to remove debris, because these in particular persist on other solanaceous crops because they use them as an alternative host. So all these mites can be managed using biocontrols before the infestations get to damaging levels. So mainly there's several species of predatory mites, and a few of these mites also eat pollen in the absence of prey and are available in these sachet forms that allow them to persist for a longer period of time in the crop. And all these mites have different ranges of humidities and temperatures in which they do the best. So it's really good to consult a biocontrol supplier on their use. And some of them don't always play nicely together with the others. So Phytocoelis persimilis is a spider mite specialist. That's that red mite. And this one is used once infestations are first detected because it needs prey to survive because it solely eats other spider mites. And the Amblysia species, those are used mostly as preventatives because they can also feed on pollen. And they're generalists, and they also eat other small pests in addition to the spider mites. So Stratiolaela scymatus, that is a soil dwelling mite. And that one can be used near where spider mites overwinter. And we've had a lot of growers with reoccurring problems that would release these along the edge of their tunnels to get some of those overwintering spider mites. And they tend to work well getting them when they start to come out in spring when things warm up and, get some on that overwintering debris. And there's also a predatory fly or a midge, and its larva is a maggot that also eats mites, and it specializes on spider mites. So a good way to monitor for spider mites is the use of bush bean trap plants. And these work well when they're young and more succulent, and you can plant them along the edges of tunnels in areas that are prone to infestations. And these are a great scouting tool because the damage shows up easily on them because their leaves are so smooth. And they grow really fast, and you can replace them readily throughout the season just by popping another bean seed in its place. And they also detect thrips. Thrips like them as well. And speaking of thrips, next up are thrips. And these are concerning because they have the ability to vector viruses like tomato spotted wilt virus. And here in the north, western flower thrips and onion thrips are the most common. And both of these species lay their eggs within plant tissues, and they usually pupate within the soil. So it's that ground portion of their life cycle that's often overlooked for management, because you really need to account for the thrips that might be emerging from the soil, even if you don't see them on the foliage. And there's a lot of immature, like the immature stages of the larva vary in shades, different shades of yellow and orange. And you find all of the larvae on the leaf undersides, but you can also find adults and larvae in any blossoms. Okay, so here's some examples of thrips damage. They cause distortion, yellowing, flecking of fruits, silver patches with dark frass, and that frass, those black dots, that's their poop. And this is an example of what the tomatoes will look like if there's a virus present. So there's many biocontrol options for thrips, ranging from predatory beetles and bugs to mites that need to be combined to get at that foliar and soil dwelling stages that thrips have. The soil dwellers are Stradulolaps schimatus. That mite will attack thrips pupae in the soil. And there's rove beetles, and both their adult and immature stages will attack soil dwelling stages of thrips. Nematodes and entopathogenic fungi like Beauveria, they're primarily soil dwelling, but they can also be used to target thrips that are on the foliage. So you have the predatory bug aureus. That's predatory in both the adult and immature stages on thrips. And there's a lot of Amblyceus species mites that attack thrips larvae on the foliage and in blossoms. So many years ago, we noticed that marigolds are highly attractive to thrips. And this is partly because of their yellow color, which makes them attractive to many insects. And that's why yellow is commonly used as sticky traps. And they can be used as a monitoring tool, but they can also have the ability to sustain natural enemies with their pollens. And what these marigolds do is they act as a trap plant, and they help to detect thrips earlier on in the season because the thrips are attracted there, and you can use this as a strategy to monitor them. So you can just tap these plants over a white laminated piece of paper to check for them. So if your thrips infestations get too high, you can just throw the plant away and replace it with a new one, or you can add natural enemies there. So we developed a marigold guardian plant system as a standalone system for thrips management. And for this, we use a marigold and we put a predatory mite sachet on it. And it was the cucumerous mite that was in that sachet. And that was going to target any thrips that were on the foliage. And then anything that escaped predation were managed in the soil with a granular formulation of Beauveria bassiana that we created on our own back then because there was no granular available. I believe there is one now, so that's different. But we used the GHA that was in Botanigard for our trials. And we tested this primarily in greenhouse ornamentals, but some of our high tunnel growers use this system, but they don't use it with the fungi. They use it with the mites instead, and they seem to really like it. So ornamental peppers can also be used to sustain the predatory bug aureus. And this aureus is actually both wild and commercially reared, but the problem is it diapauses from fall to spring, and it tends to be really slow to establish in the spring, but we find them a lot later on in the season, like July through September. So when it goes in this diapause, it goes into this resting phase. So these peppers produce a lot of pollen that the bug feeds on in the absence of their prey. And this system is used primarily for thrips control, but aureus is a generalist, and it will attack a lot of different pests like aphids and mites as well. But the drawback to using ornamental peppers is that it takes a long time for these to mature and produce pollen. So for that reason, they tend to be used more so in heated greenhouse environments and not so much high tunnels. But here's some examples of their use in cucumbers, cyclamen, mum, and gerbera production. Okay, alyssum is also used to support aureus because it acts as an alternative food source with pollens and nectars. And some growers really like to make mixes of peppers, alyssum, and marigolds, as shown by some of these examples. And I'll talk more about alyssum shortly. Okay, whiteflies. Greenhouse whitefly commonly infest tomatoes, and the silverleaf whitefly is more commonly associated with greenhouse ornamentals. So often you find silverleaf whitefly because they came in on infested stock if you have transplants that were grown in a greenhouse near ornamentals. And both can vector viruses, and they both can be suppressed using parasitic wasps. And most tomato growers use incarcia that come in this hanging tag form. And you can tell that they're working because when the wasp parasitizes immature greenhouse whitefly nymphs, they turn that black color. And it's really hard to tell adult greenhouse whiteflies from silverleaf whiteflies. But if you look at their nymphs, the greenhouse whitefly nymphs tend to be kind of cake-like with really long hairs, and silverleaf whitefly immatures tend to be more flat, pancake-like without really long hairs. So silverleaf whiteflies are parasitized by the wasp Eretmoceras. And when those are parasitized, they turn into this golden brown color. So whitefly damage is sooty mold on leaves from honeydew excretion. And there's leaf curling and yellowing and chlorosis, and sometimes you get irregular ripening of fruit if you get really crazy infestations. So Dicyphus is a predator who feeds on whiteflies, really likes whiteflies, but it does feed on some other pests. And it's used primarily for whitefly management in vegetable production that's more long-term. So it really works best if it's combined with other biocontrol agents rather than used alone. And this bug will establish, but it often takes a while for them to get going. And many farms that use them use mullein banker plants to help them along. And mulleins kind of that natural host plant for Dicyphus, and it provides that pollen and nectar for them to feed on, and it allows them to survive and reproduce even when prey is scarce. So these pictures are a few pictures of mullein from a couple of locations in Quebec that I visited last summer, because the mullein banker plant system really isn't a huge thing in the US. Probably because, it tends to be really expensive. Dicyphus in general doesn't really ship well. So I see this a lot more in Canadian production than I do so down here. Okay, so finally, there's that dreaded aphid apocalypse. Nobody likes to see all those aphids, and they're notoriously difficult to manage, and they have extremely high population growth rates, and that's because they're parthenogenic and they give live birth to little clones. So how do you know if you have aphids around? You have their cast skins, and you can see them when they're alive. And these cast skins are what happens when they molt from their different life stages, and they leave these little white casts behind. And over the years, I've had a lot of whiteflies sent to me for ID, when in fact, I got a big bag of aphid cast skins. So please get yourself a hand lens, because that helps really well with scouting. Can't believe I didn't say get a good hand lens during the scouting slide. But either way, these cast skins will flutter when you disturb the plants, and that's because they're so light, and that's why they're often confused with whiteflies. Distortion is another sign, and tomato foliage tends to look really distorted in a lot of instances, but distortion by aphids on peppers tends to be a little bit more distinct. They also leave behind a lot of poop, otherwise known as that honeydew, kind of like whiteflies leave behind, and it's really shiny and sticky and allows for that growth of sooty mold. And here's just some more examples of that black sooty mold on foliage and fruits, and more cast skins from really horrifying infestations of aphids. So aphids have both winged and non-winged adult forms. So that's why it's good to check plants and not just rely on sticky cards, because usually when aphids grow wings, it's because it's in response to overcrowding, and they're just trying to disperse to find new, less crowded areas. So immatures and nymphs do not have wings, but both adults and nymphs can cause damage. And aphids can be extremely challenging to ID, because some of the features that we use to ID them primarily relate to their head shape from their antennal tubercles, but also the length and texture of their cornicles, which are those tailpipe or stovepipe looking protrusions on their rear ends. And color is not used so much for ID because aphids can take on a lot of different color morphs. So it's good that you identify your aphids if you use biocontrol, because a lot of the parasitic wasps that are used only attack certain species of aphids. So if we're going to send in aphids to a diagnostic clinic, you want to make sure you collect as many of the biggest ones that you can. If they're winged, that's even better, because it's almost impossible to get a definitive ID off those smaller immature stages. So on tomatoes, the aphids that are of concern are potato and foxglove. And if you're growing winter greens, the winter greens will likely have green peach or foxglove. But sometimes we see potato aphids overwintering as well. So when you transition crops over in the spring, a lot of these tend to move from greens to summer crops. So in our experiences, when we've seen infestations of green peach on tomatoes, they can look really scary on those lower leaves. But after pruning a lot of those lower leaves and using biocontrols, they tend to fizzle out over time. But that's usually not the case with foxglove or potato aphid. They tend to persist and they can wreak havoc on a tomato crop if you leave them unmanaged. So foxglove aphids have these two dark spots at the base of their cornicles, and those are really easy to see with a hand lens. And if you have really good eyesight, you could even see it with your eye. Okay, so there's lots of different biocontrol agents that are commercially available for use on aphids. And predators include brown and green lacewings, lady beetles, and a predatory mite called Anestis. Anestis is a new mite that was developed over the past, 10 years or so. We just had it available commercially here in the States, but I know in Canada it's been available for a while. And that's pretty exciting. But there's also two flies that you can use for aphids, and they have larvae or maggots that consume the aphids. And those flies are syrphid flies and the aphid midge called Aphidoletes. And the good thing about a lot of these predators is that they're generalists and they attack a lot of different species of aphids. So there's also several parasitic wasps like Aphidius colemanni and urbi and Aphelinus abdominalis. So these wasps are specialists, meaning they only attack a narrow range of aphids. Hence, this is why it's really important to ID your aphids. So parasitized aphids turn into these things called mummies that turn either brown or black in color, depending on what wasp parasitized it. And they turn that color when the wasp is pupating within. So the Aphidius create these brown mummies and Aphelinus creates the black ones. And there's a lot of naturally occurring wasps out there that parasitize aphids as well. So to support these parasitic wasps, there's a few different banker plant systems that can be used. The first is a grass-based system, and this uses cereal grasses like oats, barley, or wheat. And that supports an aphid that attacks mostly grass and not your crops. And that aphid supports Aphidius colemanni. And remember, that wasp attacks either green peach or melon aphids. So what happens with this is that you purchase the grass pre-infested with a cereal aphid from a supplier, and then they're allowed to establish for a few weeks, and then the wasps are released onto the system, and then they reproduce within and then disperse into the crop in search of the pest aphids. So these systems really need to be rotated in and out of the crop. So you need really diligent timing to kind of keep up with the right time to put them out into production, because it kind of needs like an ongoing, continual source throughout the season. And here are a few, that is not the slide. Okay, oops. Okay, so here are a few examples of the systems in tomato, greens, and pepper production. And there's also a fava bean banker system, and that's kind of one of the newer ones that's available. And it uses a pea aphid to sustain the wasp parasitoid Aphidius urbi, and that manages the foxglove and potato aphids. So urbi is that larger wasp than Kolmani, and it really prefers these larger aphid species like foxglove and potato. Here's alyssum, again, because it can also be used to support aphid natural enemies. And in addition to supporting aureus, as I mentioned before, it can also attract wild syrphid flies or sustained ones that you can commercially purchase. So one of our initiatives over the past few years is to look at habitat plantings established both inside and outside tunnels to promote the establishment of a lot of naturally occurring beneficials. So at one time, we tried combinations of borage, alyssum, dill, marigolds in tunnels to see what they would attract and sustain. And alyssum was the most attractive out of this combination. It also bloomed the longest, was easy to maintain, and wasn't really as invasive as borage. Borage actually self-sows itself a lot, and it really wasn't that, I mean, it was attractive, but it was also really, really attractive to a lot of pests. So we don't really recommend trying borage as a habitat plant in tunnels for those very reasons. But on these plantings, the common visitors that we saw were syrphid flies, parasitic wasps, and the aureus pirate bugs. And kind of as a follow-up to this study, we're currently looking at different rates of alyssum established in high tunnels to see what the best rate is that contributes to pest management on high tunnel crops. And we're also testing different rates of beans and cucumbers to see which is the optimal rate to use for spider mite detections. So not only can these habitat plantings be established within, but outside too. And one of the goals of our current projects is to evaluate alyssum in the on-use space between tunnels to attract the wild natural enemies. And so by establishing these strips outside, there would be no loss of that productive growing space within the tunnel. And here's a few pictures of the process. And what we ended up doing was we tested direct seeding the alyssum versus looking at transplants into a weed barrier. And here's what they looked like at each of the sites during their peak. I would say their peak was probably July, but they looked beautiful all season until, you know, frost got them in November. They were just amazingly beautiful. They were really fragrant, and they were really, really attractive to a lot of different bugs of all kinds. So this project is ongoing, but last summer we observed over 3,000 arthropods visiting the plantings. And the most common orders that visited were flies, bugs, beetles, and bees and wasps, among others. So of the total number that visited, about 29% were natural enemies that provided pest management, at least that we were interested in observing. And this was comprised mostly of syrphid fly adults, aureus adults, and nymphs, small aphid parasitic wasps, and others like tachinid wasps, or tachinid flies. Sorry, they're not wasps, misspoke. Lady beetles, lacewings, rove beetles, assassin bugs, predatory thrips. There are thrips that are actually predatory, believe it or not. There are also lots of spiders. So the top pests that we observed on these strips were actually tarnished plant bugs and flea beetles and some pest thrips. But even though we saw a lot of potential crop pests, the most abundant pests that we saw really were not observed causing any damage to the adjacent tunnel crops. So here are some pictures of some of the natural enemies that we saw on tunnel crops and on the alyssum outside. And while some of these were purchased and kind of flew in from other tunnels that were in the experiment, many were not, like these parasitic wasps called preyons. And that's you can see that on the bottom left of the screen. And that's an aphid parasite, and its mummies look like an aphid raised up on a pedestal. And we also saw a lot of wild green lacewings and a lot of different predatory maggots. So those green and brown ones are syrphid fly maggots, and the orange ones are aphids. And many of the species of hoverflies that visited that attacked aphids were ones like the common flower fly and the margin calligrapher. And then there was a lot of other syrphid species that visited that don't attack aphids, like the drone fly. And I don't have a picture of that here, but it's kind of a really big chunky syrphid fly that you see a lot in the fall. And that one actually feeds on dead and decaying organic matter. We also saw a lot of tachinids, and an example is a swift feather-legged fly. And those flies, they're parasitoids. Their larvae are parasitoids of squash and stink bugs. But we also saw a lot of aureus that were coming in from the wild. So yeah, like it's really important that you get to know your wild natural enemies, because there's just so many of them out there. And I learn new things every day with the natural enemy complexes. Okay, so as I kind of wrap up this talk here, other than get to know your friends, I just want to say that remember that when using biocontrol, that timing is everything. So this here is just an example of, getting the timing right. So suppose that you pull all your aphid infested greens and you plant a mixture of summer crops. If you have aphids on them, make sure you identify those, because if you choose the parasitic wasps, remember they're host specific, so they attack certain aphid species, and you want to be ready for them when you turn the tunnel over. So when turnover happens, you really want to make sure that you get those habitat and banker plant systems there from the get-go to help build those natural enemies early. So that means you got to think ahead and plant those plants for beneficials probably like 6 weeks or so before you plan on turning things over, because you really want these things flowering when you want to get your natural enemies established, because you're trying to get everything established early. So if you release wasps like aphids flies and predatory bugs aureus as preventatives early, knowing that there are aphid infestations going into the season, this is really going to help you prevent the chances of an aphid apocalypse happening midsummer. So if you do find some of these hot spots and you did all this preventative stuff, you want to consider things like those generalist predators like lacewings or the predatory mite anistis, or any of those generalists that need high prey populations to survive. Those should be considered to kind of get some of those hot spots reduced. So, and that's just because those predators really need a lot of prey to stick around. Same goes for lady beetles. Lady beetles also need a lot of prey to stick around. So scouting throughout is really essential, because you really need to make sure that these natural enemies are doing their job, or you need to know if you need to purchase additional natural enemies, or maybe you have to bail and use some sort of pesticide because the population just got it out of control. But really they shouldn't, if you're proactive about using biocontrols and scouting and taking care of these things before these problems get out of control. So finally, biocontrol takes time and effort. And the easiest way to prepare for releases is to kind of pair them with your planting schedule. And it's really good to get things down on paper to somehow visualize your plan, like an Excel sheet, as an example. And this can act just as a reference point, and you can tweak them over time and year after year, and it helps you track what worked and what didn't. And this is just a total hypothetical example of what this could look like based on crop date, pest, and biocontrol options. Many biocontrol suppliers should assist you with setting up preventative release schedules and regular deliveries, so you don't forget to order. And some of our growers actually don't schedule and they order as needed, but oftentimes, they tend to miss the critical timing of the releases of the natural enemies, and the result are pest populations that get out of control, right? So having them there on your doorstep, it's like, oh, my preventatives are here, and you can just put them out. And it's just getting in the habit of doing things preventatively. But every farm is different, and scheduling releases really is based on the problem history, crop mixes, and how much money that you really want to spend. And that's what it comes down to. I mean, there's not like a cookbook here for, you know, each farm. There's like not one universal sort of biocontrol plan. Is you got to find something that works for you within your budget. But if you do have all these reoccurring pest issues and it's something that you struggle with, it's sometimes all it takes is just tweaking that timing of your control method just a little bit. And, you know, only keeping really good notes is pretty much the only way that you can kind of, you know, recognize that. And that's all I have to talk about for today. I know it's kind of an overwhelming, a lot of information in a very short amount of time, but I can answer any questions if anyone has questions. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. That was fantastic. That was so much information, but I love it. So yeah, everyone feel free to pop any questions in the chat or just unmute yourself. And in the process, I'm just gonna rapid fire at you if you're ready for it. So I have a few questions. When it comes to insect ID, obviously that's a very important part of implementing the right control. Do you have any like apps that you recommend or have found to be useful?
That's a really good question. There are some scouting apps that are available. But to be honest, I haven't really played with a lot of the different apps that are out there. I know there's some really good. It's a tough one. See, because you really need to have good, if you're going to ID things yourself, you have to have really good magnification, because it's so hard. It's so hard to get a good ID just based off a picture. And I mean, AI is getting a little bit better from what I understand about identifying things from a picture, but you just got to be careful, especially things like aphids that they're really hard to identify from a picture. But there's kind of some of these usual suspects, and there are a few websites out there, like there's an aphid ID that gives some really good images of, you know, their heads and their cornicles, but you really need high magnification in order to get down to that species level. There's another Thrips ID website. I think it's based out of somewhere in Europe, but there's the most beautiful pictures of all these different Thrips species as well.
Cool. Yeah, and so I've heard good things about, I think it's Seek by iNaturalist, and maybe where that might not be a great tool for like aphid identification, maybe for like natural predators or kind of just other things you see flying around, maybe is a good place to start. But I like your point on the aphids. Like it can be worth getting that actually identified by an entomologist or someone who knows bugs before sort of going through and purchasing sort of your plan, your response plan.
That's correct. And usually, I mean, you can buy a lot of natural enemies as mixes, so it's kind of like covers all your bases. Totally. Or you can just kind of not use a predator or a parasite and use like predator. But yeah, iNaturalist is also it's a good website to kind of look at the time of year to see a lot of those larger beneficials and pests that might be visiting your crops. But you know, there is some error. You want to make sure that they're research grade, because sometimes there are some, you know, misidentifications on there when it's, you know, publicly sourced. Yeah, but yeah, that is a good one as well.
So we have a few questions. We'll start off with the first one. Regarding marigolds, is there a specific variety to look for? And then do you recommend that they're grown from seed versus purchased in terms of pesticide residue?
Yeah, we grow ours from seed, and we've used French varieties. Hero, we've used the Hero Yellow. I think there's different Hero ones now. But we also did a study where we looked at the different French varieties, and we didn't really see any differences in attractiveness, because our growers are like, oh, well, which variety do we use? And we're like, oh, gee, that's a really good question. So we did like a really small study on that looked at that, but we grow them from seed, and it really takes a good 6 to 8 weeks to kind of get them big enough before they're ready to hit that early season. But yeah, I would be definitely concerned about pesticide residues on any, trap or habitat plant that, you're going to use to attract them.
All right, next question. If we put down a theta in the fall for overwintering green crops, will they overwinter to help prevent springtail damage in spring greens?
That's a really good question. And I don't know, I'll be honest, I don't know 100% know the answer to that, because I don't know what their overwintering temperature would be, because they're going to have their survival temperature. I think it depends on how cold the tunnel gets. Like if you're if growers are heating their soil, then they should be, if it's above, freezing, then they should be able to survive. But if it gets really, really cold into a deep freeze, and they might not. See, because it's all about the freezing, because that's where we started seeing so many more issues like broad mites and everything else. And because everything's just starting to overwinter. And now that these winters are so warm, that I don't think we really know or fully understand the survival of a lot of these pests and their natural enemies complexes within tunnels, just for that very reason.
Okay, so did the alyssum go to seed? Like, is that something that'll kind of just keep going, or is that like a let's plant it fresh every year?
In tunnels, we've seen it come back.
Okay.
Where I can answer that question in about 2 months for the outside strips that we did, because it's a tender perennial, so it just depends.
It could be a year-to-year thing too.
Yeah, it depends on the temperature and how harsh of a winter it was. So we're gonna look right at that to see if it came back.
One other question for you. Are you looking at cyclamen mite at all? Like, do you work with that, or not so much? Okay.
Not so much. We see the strawberry cyclamen mites pop up, especially the past couple of years. I've seen them show up.
Mm-hmm.
Every once in a while, but it's just, managing residues and stuff. And usually they have strawberries. You see a lot of them, or just like outside, or
we're kind of, yeah, I think they're getting, I don't know if they're worse, but I feel like we've been talking about them the last few years. I don't know that we have great chemical control, and I do know that there is some work being done on like biologicals to target them. But yeah, they're kind of a tricky beast. And I think it's mostly like coming in on, right? It's those transplants that are coming in from other places, and they're super, super small and hard to find. And yeah, so we're kind of just going to start playing around with them, some stuff, I think, this year, just to see if we can try to knock those back.
Yeah. I kind of left cyclamen mite out this talk. I'm like, oh, there's so much stuff here. And like, I won't talk about that. But yeah, cyclamen mite. So that's the problem, is the damage looks very similar to broad mite, right? So you get this distortion, and it's like, oh, I don't know which one it is. And if you look at it, because they're so microscopic, I mean, that's something you have to send away for ID unless you got really, really good microscopes. And it's just looking at the eggs, because the broad mites have their egg is like mottled, whereas, the cyclamen mite is smooth. So that's just the one way to tell them apart. But that's another one where you got to get, it's hard. You got to get them early with biocontrol, but do you really ever get it? You want to rogue them out, but if you know what plants are prone to them, it can kind of get them at the right time. So the cyclamen mite issues that I've seen have been on peppers in the fields, and that's because they grew like a field of strawberries, and they were like, we're gonna go over here.
Brutal.
And they're like, are they gonna come back? I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, call me in 8 months and tell me.
Yeah, it's like, well, I mean, if you're worried about them coming back, just put a bunch of sachets and predatory mice on your peppers if it's all going to stay here. And then hopefully that should get anything that comes up, from the field. Because it's that proactive use. And like a lot of times the predatory mites are fairly inexpensive, especially for growing cucumbers. And like if you're gonna expect, if you had spider mites in your tunnels and you're growing cucumbers, if you had them one year, you better expect that you're gonna have them the next year and the year after, because they just keep building up, building up, building up. But you can manage them, you can get rid of them. It just might take a couple years with diligent, either you rotate out of there or you really beef up the biocontrol program to get them at bay, keep them at bay.
No, I think, and I think that's a great point to sort of let up on, is that sometimes these are going to take a few years to sort of really knock it back, and we kind of just have to be persistent. And I think that preventative release is, like you mentioned, the timing is super important for these things to work, and you got to just be there from the get-go and make sure the right food is there if they need food, sort of for that ramp up period as well.
Yeah, it's plan ahead.
Yep. Yep. All right. So I don't think we have any other questions. So I'm going to pop the pesticide point survey into the chat. If you open it up, just enter your information there. I will hang out, but Cheryl, you are free to go. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge.
Absolutely. This was fun.
Yeah, this was great. Really nice to sort of get going on the IPM side of things. So we'll have to touch base and see how your research goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay tuned. Thank you so much. This was great. Good luck,
Have a
everyone,
good
this
day.
season.
Bye.